Crop diversity and climate resilience building food security in a changing climate. Agriculture is entering a period of unprecedented change. Around the world, farmers are facing rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, more frequent droughts, floods, storms, and the growing spread of pests and diseases. These environmental changes are affecting agricultural productivity and creating new risks for food systems that support billions of people. Crop diversity and climate resilience building food security At the same time, global food security remains under pressure. Hundreds of millions of people continue to experience hunger, while billions more face varying degrees of food insecurity. As populations grow and climate conditions become increasingly unpredictable, ensuring a stable and reliable food supply has become one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. Modern agriculture depends heavily on a relatively small number of crops. Rice, wheat, and maize provide a large share of the calories consumed worldwide. While these crops have helped feed a growing global population, dependence on a limited number of species also creates vulnerability. When environmental conditions change or new biological threats emerge, entire production systems can be placed at risk. One of nature's most powerful responses to uncertainty is diversity. Throughout history, farmers and communities have cultivated thousands of crop species and countless varieties adapted to different climates, soils, cultures, and growing conditions. This diversity represents a vast reservoir of genetic resources that can help agriculture adapt to changing environments. Crop diversity includes the variety of crop species we cultivate. The diversity found within each crop species, traditional farmer-developed landraces, and the wild relatives from which many crops originated. Together, these forms of diversity provide the biological foundation for resilience, adaptation, and long-term food security. In this module, we will explore how crop diversity strengthens agricultural systems, reduces vulnerability to climate-related shocks, supports stable food production, and contributes to resilient food systems capable of meeting future challenges. We will examine the scientific evidence, the role of genetic diversity, the importance of conservation, and the practical strategies being used around the world to build climate-resilient agriculture. Understanding crop diversity is not simply about understanding plants. It is about understanding how biodiversity, agriculture, climate adaptation, food security, and human well-being are interconnected within a complex and rapidly changing world. We will examine diversity at multiple levels, including diversity among crop species, diversity within crop species, traditional farmer-developed varieties known as landraces, and the wild relatives that contribute valuable genetic traits to modern agriculture. You will also learn how climate change affects agricultural systems. Rising temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, extreme weather events, and expanding pest and disease pressures are transforming growing conditions around the world. Understanding these pressures is essential for understanding why resilient agricultural systems are becoming increasingly important. A central theme of this module is the relationship between diversity and resilience. We will explore how biological diversity helps agricultural systems absorb shocks, adapt to changing conditions, and continue functioning even when individual crops or varieties face environmental stress. You will also examine how crop diversity contributes to food security. Diverse agricultural systems can help stabilize production, reduce risk, improve nutrition, and support the livelihoods of farming communities. In a world facing increasing uncertainty, diversity acts as a form of biological insurance that helps safeguard food supplies. Another important objective is understanding the conservation of genetic resources. We will explore why protecting crop varieties, traditional landraces, seed collections, and wild relatives is essential for future agricultural adaptation. These resources provide the raw genetic material needed to develop crops capable of thriving under changing climatic conditions. Finally, we will apply systems thinking to agriculture and climate adaptation. Rather than viewing crops, farmers, ecosystems, and food systems as separate components, we will examine how they interact within a larger system. This perspective helps reveal how decisions made today can influence resilience, sustainability, and food security for future generations. As we move through the module, keep these learning objectives in mind. Together, they provide a framework for understanding how crop diversity supports resilient agriculture and why it is increasingly recognized as a critical component of climate adaptation strategies worldwide. Before we begin exploring the science of crop diversity and climate resilience, it is useful to understand what this module aims to accomplish. Climate change is creating complex challenges for agriculture, food systems, and rural livelihoods. Addressing these challenges requires more than simply understanding individual crops or farming practices. It requires an appreciation of how biological diversity contributes to adaptation, resilience, and long-term sustainability. By the end of this module, you will be able to explain what crop diversity is and why it matters. Crop diversity is one of the most important yet often overlooked foundations of global food security. For thousands of years, farmers have cultivated a wide range of crops and crop varieties adapted to different climates, soils, landscapes, and cultural traditions. This diversity has enabled agriculture to thrive across an extraordinary range of environmental conditions and has provided humanity with the biological resources needed to adapt to change. Today, however, agriculture faces growing challenges. Climate change is increasing temperatures, altering rainfall patterns, intensifying droughts and floods, and expanding the range of pests and diseases. These changes are creating new risks for agricultural production at a time when global demand for food continues to rise. Modern food systems also depend heavily on a relatively small number of crops. Rice, wheat, and maize provide a significant share of the world's food supply. While these crops are essential to global nutrition, dependence on a limited number of species and varieties can increase vulnerability when environmental conditions become unstable. Crop diversity helps reduce this vulnerability. Agricultural systems that contain a wider range of crops and crop varieties are generally more resilient to climatic shocks. Different crops respond differently to environmental stress. When drought, heat, flooding, or disease affects one crop, others may continue to perform well, helping to stabilize production and reduce overall risk. The benefits of crop diversity extend beyond production stability. Diverse agricultural systems often support healthier soils, more effective pest management, greater biodiversity, improved resource efficiency, and more nutritious diets. These benefits strengthen both ecological and social resilience. At the genetic level, diversity provides the raw material for adaptation. Traits such as drought tolerance, heat tolerance, salinity tolerance, flood resistance, and disease resistance are often found within traditional crop varieties and wild relatives. Plant breeders depend upon these genetic resources to develop improved varieties capable of thriving under changing environmental conditions. The conservation of crop diversity has therefore become a global priority. Seed banks, gene banks, botanical collections, research institutions, farming communities, and international organizations are working together to preserve and utilize genetic resources before they are lost through genetic erosion. Protecting this diversity helps ensure that future generations will have access to the biological tools needed to respond to emerging challenges. Research from around the world increasingly demonstrates that crop diversification can strengthen agricultural resilience. Diverse farming systems often experience lower production variability, improved recovery following environmental shocks, and greater capacity to adapt to uncertain future conditions. While crop diversity is not a complete solution to climate change, it represents an important component of broader adaptation and food security strategies. This module explores how crop diversity contributes to climate resilience, examines the scientific evidence supporting diversification, and highlights the role of genetic resources in building sustainable food systems. The central message is straightforward but powerful. Diversity increases options, and in a world characterized by uncertainty, options create resilience. As climate change accelerates and agricultural systems face mounting pressures, preserving and utilizing crop diversity may prove to be one of humanity's most valuable investments in food security, sustainability, and long-term well-being. Throughout this module, we have repeatedly encountered a central idea. Diversity creates resilience, but what is it about diversity that makes adaptation possible? The answer lies in genetic diversity. Genetic diversity refers to the variation in genes that exists within a species. These genetic differences influence the characteristics of individual plants, including their growth patterns, tolerance to environmental stress, resistance to pests and diseases, nutrient requirements, and reproductive success. Although plants belonging to the same species may appear similar, they often possess important genetic differences. These differences determine how individual plants respond to the environment around them. For example, two varieties of the same crop may react very differently to drought. One variety may continue producing underwater stress, while another experiences severe yield losses. Similarly, some varieties may tolerate heat, flooding, salinity, or disease better than others. These differences are not random. They are the result of thousands of years of evolution, natural selection, and human selection. Over generations, plants have adapted to diverse environments, creating a vast reservoir of genetic variation that supports survival under different conditions. This genetic variation functions as nature's adaptation toolkit. Just as a carpenter relies on a toolbox containing different tools for different tasks, agriculture relies on genetic diversity to address different environmental challenges. Each gene, trait, and variety represents a potential solution to a particular problem. When environmental conditions remain stable, the value of this diversity may not always be obvious. However, when conditions change, genetic diversity becomes critically important. Consider the challenges facing agriculture today. Rising temperatures, prolonged droughts, changing rainfall patterns, increasing soil salinity, emerging pests, and evolving diseases are creating new pressures on food production systems around the world. To adapt to these changes, crops must possess traits that allow them to survive and perform under new conditions. Some plants carry genes that improve drought tolerance. Others possess traits that enable them to withstand extreme heat. Some varieties can survive periodic flooding. Others resist specific insects, fungi, bacteria, or viruses. Still others can grow in soils affected by salinity or nutrient limitations. The greater the genetic diversity available within a crop species, the greater the likelihood that useful traits can be found when new challenges emerge. This is why plant breeders place such importance on genetic resources. Modern crop improvement depends heavily on identifying beneficial traits and incorporating them into new varieties. When breeders seek to develop crops capable of thriving under changing climatic conditions, they often search among traditional varieties, landraces, and crop-wild relatives for useful genetic characteristics. Many of the climate-resilient crops being developed today contain genetic material derived from these diverse sources. Traits that enhance drought tolerance, disease resistance, or heat tolerance frequently originate from genetic resources that have been conserved over many generations. Without genetic diversity, adaptation would become extremely difficult. If every plant within a species were genetically identical, a threat capable of affecting one individual could potentially affect all individuals. Such uniformity would leave agricultural systems highly vulnerable to environmental change. Diversity provides alternatives. When conditions change, some plants may struggle while others continue to perform well. Those successful individuals become valuable sources of traits that can be used for future breeding and adaptation efforts. This process mirrors a fundamental principle of evolution itself. Diversity creates variation. Variation creates options, and options allow adaptation. Scientists increasingly recognize that genetic diversity represents one of agriculture's most important strategic resources. It is the biological foundation upon which future adaptation depends. The value of genetic diversity becomes even clearer when we consider climate change. Future environmental conditions are unlikely to resemble those of the past. New combinations of temperature, rainfall, pests, diseases, and environmental stresses will emerge. Agriculture will require a continuous supply of adaptive solutions. Genetic diversity provides those solutions. Every traditional variety preserved by farmers, every seed stored in a gene bank, and every crop-wild relative conserved in nature may contain genetic traits that become valuable in the future. In this sense, genetic diversity is not simply a scientific concept. It is a reservoir of possibility. It provides the raw material that enables crops to evolve, breeders to innovate, farmers to adapt, and food systems to remain resilient in an uncertain world. As we move to the next section, we will examine some of the specific traits that genetic diversity provides, including drought tolerance, heat tolerance, flood resistance, salinity tolerance, and resistance to pests and diseases. These traits illustrate how nature's adaptation toolkit operates in practice and why preserving genetic diversity is essential for the future of agriculture. In the previous slide, we described genetic diversity as nature's adaptation toolkit. We learned that genetic variation provides the raw material that enables crops to adapt to changing environmental conditions. But what exactly does this adaptation look like in practice? The answer lies in specific traits. A trait is a characteristic or feature of a plant that influences how it grows, survives, and reproduces. Some traits affect productivity, such as grain size or growth rate. Others influence a plant's ability to cope with environmental stress. These adaptive traits are becoming increasingly important as climate change alters growing conditions around the world. One of the most valuable adaptive traits is drought tolerance. Water scarcity is already affecting many agricultural regions, and climate change is expected to intensify drought conditions in numerous parts of the world. Drought-tolerant crops possess characteristics that allow them to survive and continue producing under limited water availability. These characteristics may include deeper root systems, improved water use efficiency, reduced water loss through leaves, or physiological mechanisms that help maintain growth during periods of stress. Heat tolerance is another critical trait. Many crops evolved under climatic conditions that are now changing rapidly. Rising temperatures can affect photosynthesis, flowering, pollination, grain development, and overall productivity. Heat-tolerant varieties possess genetic characteristics that allow them to function more effectively under elevated temperatures. As heat waves become more frequent and intense, these traits are becoming increasingly valuable. Flood tolerance represents another important adaptation. While some regions are becoming drier, others are experiencing heavier rainfall and more frequent flooding. Excess water can deprive plant roots of oxygen, damage tissues, and reduce yields. Certain crop varieties possess adaptations that allow them to survive temporary flooding and recover when water levels recede. These traits are particularly important in river basins, coastal regions, and flood-prone agricultural landscapes. Salinity tolerance is gaining attention as well. Rising sea levels, saltwater intrusion, irrigation practices, and changing hydrological conditions are increasing soil salinity in many parts of the world. Saline soils can reduce water uptake and impair plant growth. Salinity-tolerant crops possess mechanisms that enable them to function despite elevated salt concentrations, making them valuable resources for future agriculture. Resistance to pests and diseases is another major category of adaptive traits. Climate change is altering the distribution and behavior of many insects, pathogens, and weeds. Warmer temperatures can allow pests and diseases to expand into new regions, creating challenges for crops that have not previously encountered them. Genetic resistance provides a natural form of protection, reducing losses and decreasing dependence on chemical controls. Some crops also possess traits that improve nutrient use efficiency. These plants can maintain productivity while requiring fewer inputs or growing in nutrient-poor soils. Such traits can contribute to sustainability while reducing production costs and environmental impacts. Importantly, these traits rarely exist in isolation. A single variety may possess several adaptive characteristics simultaneously. For example, a crop may combine drought tolerance with heat resistance and disease resistance. Plant breeders increasingly seek to develop varieties that integrate multiple beneficial traits, enabling crops to cope with a wide range of environmental challenges. This is where genetic diversity becomes so valuable. The traits needed for future adaptation are often scattered across thousands of traditional varieties, land races, and wild relatives. One variety may contain drought tolerance genes, another may provide disease resistance, a third may contribute flood tolerance. By conserving and studying these genetic resources, researchers can identify useful traits and incorporate them into improved crop varieties. Many of today's climate-resilient crops are the result of this process. Breeders search the vast reservoir of genetic diversity for characteristics that help crops survive under changing conditions. Without access to diverse genetic resources, many of these innovations would not be possible. A useful way to think about adaptive traits is to imagine a toolbox designed for climate resilience. Each trait represents a different tool. Drought tolerance helps address water scarcity. Heat tolerance responds to rising temperatures. Flood tolerance manages excess water. Disease resistance combats biological threats. The larger the toolbox, the greater the ability to respond to future challenges. And because the future remains uncertain, maintaining a large and diverse toolbox becomes increasingly important. No one can predict exactly which environmental stresses will be most significant in the coming decades. Some regions may become hotter, others may become wetter, new pests and diseases may emerge, market conditions may change. The more genetic options available, the greater the ability of agriculture to adapt. This understanding reinforces one of the central messages of this module. Crop diversity is not simply about preserving the past, it is about preparing for the future. The adaptive traits contained within diverse crop varieties represent biological solutions developed through thousands of years of evolution and human selection. These solutions may prove essential as agriculture confronts the challenges of a changing climate. In the next section, we will examine how plant breeders, researchers, and farmers use these traits to develop climate-resilient crop varieties and strengthen food security in an increasingly uncertain world. To fully appreciate the value of genetic diversity, it is helpful to understand the natural processes that created this diversity in the first place. The remarkable variety found within crops today is the result of evolution and adaptation operating over thousands and in some cases millions of years. These processes have shaped the characteristics of plants, allowing them to survive and reproduce under a wide range of environmental conditions. Evolution can be understood as the gradual change in the genetic makeup of populations over time. Within every population of plants, genetic variation exists naturally. Some individuals possess traits that make them better suited to particular environmental conditions than others. When environmental conditions favor certain traits, plants carrying those traits are more likely to survive, reproduce, and pass their genes to the next generation. Over many generations, these advantageous characteristics become more common within the population. This process is known as natural selection. Adaptation is the outcome of this process. An adaptation is a characteristic that improves an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. Adaptations can take many forms. They may involve physiological processes, structural characteristics, reproductive strategies, or responses to environmental stress. For example, plants growing in dry environments may develop deeper root systems that allow them to access water stored deeper in the soil. Plants exposed to high temperatures may evolve mechanisms that protect cellular structures from heat damage. Species living in saline environments may acquire the ability to regulate salt concentrations within their tissues. Over long periods of time, these adaptations enable populations to become better suited to their environments. The story of agriculture is closely linked to this evolutionary process. Long before the development of modern plant breeding, farmers were actively shaping crop evolution. Each time farmers selected seeds from the healthiest, most productive, or most resilient plants, they influenced the genetic composition of future generations. This process of human selection operated alongside natural selection. Farmers selected for desirable characteristics such as taste, yield, storage quality, drought tolerance, pest resistance, and adaptation to local growing conditions. Over centuries, these repeated selections produced the diverse crop varieties and land races that form the foundation of agricultural diversity today. In many ways, traditional farming communities served as evolutionary partners with nature. Different regions produced different varieties because environmental conditions differed. Crops growing in mountainous areas evolved different characteristics from those cultivated in river valleys. Varieties adapted to drought-prone regions developed different traits than those grown in humid environments. The result was the creation of thousands of locally adapted crop varieties, each representing a unique evolutionary response to specific environmental conditions. Climate change is now introducing a new chapter in this evolutionary story. Environmental conditions are changing more rapidly than many agricultural systems have experienced in recent history. Rising temperatures, altered rainfall patterns, expanding pest ranges, and increasing climate variability are creating new selection pressures on crops around the world. To remain productive under these conditions, agriculture must continue adapting. This is where genetic diversity becomes essential. Evolution and adaptation can only occur when variation exists. Without genetic diversity, there is little raw material upon which natural selection or plant breeding can operate. A genetically uniform population has limited capacity to respond to new environmental challenges. In contrast, genetically diverse populations contain a wider range of traits and characteristics. Some individuals may already possess adaptations that become valuable under future climatic conditions. These individuals can serve as sources of resilience and adaptation. Modern plant breeding essentially accelerates this process. Rather than waiting for adaptation to occur over many generations, breeders identify useful traits within diverse genetic resources and incorporate them into improved varieties. The success of this approach depends upon maintaining access to broad pools of genetic diversity. Scientists increasingly recognize that adaptation is not a one-time event. It is a continuous process. As environmental conditions continue to change, agriculture will require ongoing adaptation. New varieties will need to be developed, new traits will become important, new environmental challenges will emerge. The ability of agriculture to respond successfully will depend largely on the diversity available within its genetic resources. This perspective highlights an important lesson. Crop diversity is not merely a collection of plants, it is a living record of evolutionary history and a reservoir of future adaptive potential. Every traditional variety, every landrace, and every crop-wild relative represents a unique set of evolutionary solutions to environmental challenges. Preserving this diversity helps ensure that agriculture retains the capacity to adapt to whatever conditions the future may bring. In the next section, we will explore how scientists, breeders, and conservationists work to protect this evolutionary heritage through seed banks, gene banks, and global conservation efforts designed to safeguard crop diversity for future generations. Agriculture has always been vulnerable to environmental conditions. Crops depend on sunlight, temperature, water, soil quality, pollinators, and countless ecological interactions that support plant growth and development. When these conditions change, agricultural productivity can be affected. What makes climate change particularly significant is that it influences many of these factors simultaneously. Rather than creating a single challenge, climate change creates multiple interacting pressures that affect crops, livestock, ecosystems, and food systems at the same time. These pressures increase agricultural vulnerability and make adaptation more complex. Agricultural vulnerability can be understood as the degree to which a farming system is susceptible to harm from environmental change. Vulnerability depends on three key factors: exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure refers to the extent to which a system experiences climate-related stresses such as droughts, floods, heat waves, storms, or changing rainfall patterns. Sensitivity refers to how strongly crops, livestock, and ecosystems respond to those stresses. Adaptive capacity refers to the ability of farmers, communities, institutions, and agricultural systems to adjust, recover, and continue functioning despite environmental change. Climate change affects all three dimensions. Many regions are becoming more exposed to climate-related hazards. Rising temperatures are increasing heat stress. Changing rainfall patterns are creating both drought and flood risks. Extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and more intense. At the same time, the sensitivity of agricultural systems is increasing. Many crops evolved under climatic conditions that are now changing rapidly. Temperature thresholds that once occurred rarely are becoming more common. Growing seasons are shifting, water availability is becoming less predictable, pest and disease pressures are changing. These developments can reduce productivity, increase production risks, and create uncertainty for farmers. One of the most immediate vulnerabilities involves water. Agriculture is highly dependent on reliable water supplies. Climate change affects water availability through altered precipitation patterns, increased evaporation, shrinking glaciers, changing snowpack dynamics, and more frequent droughts. In many regions, farmers are already experiencing growing uncertainty regarding water resources. Heat stress presents another major challenge. Higher temperatures can accelerate crop development, shorten growing periods, reduce pollination success, and lower yields. Livestock may also experience reduced productivity, lower reproductive performance, and increased health risks during periods of extreme heat. Climate change is also influencing biological threats. Many pests, weeds, and pathogens are expanding into new geographic areas as temperatures rise. Warmer conditions may allow multiple pest generations within a single season, increasing crop damage. Diseases that were once confined to specific regions may begin affecting agricultural systems that have little natural resistance. The effects extend beyond individual farms. Food processing facilities, storage systems, transportation networks, markets, and supply chains can all be disrupted by climate-related events. A flood that damages roads or ports can interrupt food distribution. A drought affecting one region can influence food prices across entire countries or even globally. The interconnected nature of modern food systems means that local climate impacts can have far-reaching consequences. Importantly, vulnerability is not distributed equally. Smallholder farmers often face greater challenges because they may have limited access to irrigation, credit, insurance, improved seeds, climate information, and agricultural support services. Communities already experiencing poverty or food insecurity frequently have fewer resources available to adapt and recover. This unequal vulnerability means that climate change can widen existing social and economic inequalities unless effective adaptation measures are implemented. One of the most important lessons from climate science is that future agricultural conditions are likely to become more variable and less predictable. Historically, farmers could often rely on past experience as a guide for future decisions. While weather varied from year to year, long-term climatic patterns remained relatively stable. Climate change is altering that relationship. The past is becoming a less reliable guide to the future. This growing uncertainty increases the importance of resilience. Agricultural systems must be capable of functioning under a wider range of environmental conditions. They must be able to absorb shocks, recover from disturbances, and adapt to changing circumstances. This is where crop diversity plays a crucial role. Diverse agricultural systems often possess greater adaptive capacity because they contain a broader range of traits, species, and responses to environmental stress. Diversity creates flexibility, reduces dependence on any single solution, and provides multiple pathways for adaptation. In many respects, climate change and agricultural vulnerability are two sides of the same coin. As climate risks increase, so does the importance of resilience-building strategies. Understanding vulnerability helps us identify where adaptation is needed. Understanding diversity helps us understand how adaptation can occur. Together, these insights provide a foundation for building agricultural systems that are better prepared for the uncertainties of the future and more capable of sustaining food security in a changing climate. Agriculture has always operated in an environment of uncertainty. However, the nature, scale, and complexity of future risks are expected to be unlike anything experienced in modern agricultural history. For generations, farmers adapted to seasonal variations and occasional extreme events. Climate change is altering this reality by increasing both the frequency and intensity of environmental stresses while introducing entirely new challenges that agricultural systems must confront. One of the most significant future risks is rising temperature. Global average temperatures continue to increase, and many agricultural regions are already experiencing more frequent heat waves and longer periods of extreme heat. As temperatures rise, crops may experience reduced productivity, increased water demand, lower pollination success, and greater physiological stress. Some regions may eventually become unsuitable for crops that have historically been cultivated there. Changes in rainfall patterns represent another major source of risk. Climate models project that some regions will become drier, while others may experience heavier and more erratic rainfall. Farmers may face longer droughts, shorter growing seasons, delayed planting periods, or increased flooding. Water management is therefore expected to become one of the defining agricultural challenges of the 21st century. Extreme weather events are also likely to become more disruptive. Heat waves, droughts, floods, storms, wildfires, and other climate-related disasters can damage crops, livestock, infrastructure, and rural communities. Recovery may require substantial investments, and repeated shocks can undermine the long-term viability of agricultural enterprises. Future risks are not limited to climate alone. Pests and diseases are expected to become increasingly important challenges. As temperatures rise and ecosystems shift, insects, pathogens, and weeds may expand into new geographic regions. Crops that previously faced limited biological pressure may encounter entirely new threats. Farmers and researchers will need to respond continuously to these evolving risks. Soil degradation presents another concern. Healthy soils are the foundation of productive agriculture, yet many agricultural regions already face problems related to erosion, declining organic matter, nutrient depletion, salinization, and compaction. Climate change can intensify these problems by increasing drought stress, accelerating erosion during extreme rainfall events, and affecting soil biological activity. Biodiversity loss also creates long-term risks. Many agricultural systems depend upon pollinators, beneficial insects, soil organisms, and other ecosystem services. Declines in biodiversity can reduce resilience and increase dependence on external inputs. The loss of genetic diversity within crops themselves may further limit future adaptation options. Economic risks are becoming increasingly interconnected with environmental risks. Global food systems are highly integrated. Disruptions in one part of the world can affect food prices, supply chains, and market stability elsewhere. Droughts, trade disruptions, geopolitical conflicts, fertilizer shortages, and transportation challenges can all influence agricultural profitability and food security. The World Bank and other international organizations have highlighted how climate shocks, conflicts, and market disruptions increasingly interact to create compound risks for food systems. These interacting pressures can amplify one another, making adaptation more difficult and increasing uncertainty for farmers and policymakers alike. Another important future risk involves uncertainty itself. Agricultural planning has traditionally relied on historical experience. Farmers often used past climate patterns to guide planting decisions, crop selection, and resource management. As climate change accelerates, historical conditions may become less reliable indicators of future outcomes. This means that agricultural systems must become more adaptable rather than simply more productive. Future resilience will depend on flexibility, learning, innovation, and the ability to respond to unexpected conditions. Systems designed for a narrow range of environmental circumstances may struggle when those circumstances change. This is where crop diversity becomes increasingly valuable. Diversity does not eliminate future risks, but it helps create options for managing them. Different crops and varieties respond differently to environmental stress. Some may tolerate heat, others may resist disease, some may survive drought, flooding, or salinity. The greater the diversity available within agricultural systems, the greater the capacity to adapt to uncertain futures. In many ways, crop diversity functions as a form of preparedness. Just as societies prepare for uncertain futures by investing in education, infrastructure, healthcare, and emergency planning, agriculture prepares for uncertainty by maintaining a broad portfolio of genetic resources and adaptive options. The future of agriculture will undoubtedly present challenges. Some risks can be anticipated, while others may emerge unexpectedly. What remains clear is that resilience will become increasingly important. The question is not whether agriculture will face future risks. The question is whether agricultural systems will possess the diversity, flexibility, and adaptive capacity needed to respond successfully. As we continue through this module, we will explore how conservation efforts, gene banks, and global initiatives are working to ensure that the genetic resources needed for future adaptation remain available to farmers, researchers, and future generations. Throughout this module, we have examined individual topics such as climate change, food security, crop diversity, genetic resources, adaptation, and resilience. While each of these subjects is important on its own, their true significance becomes apparent only when we understand how they are connected. This is where systems thinking becomes valuable. Systems thinking is an approach that focuses on relationships, interactions, and feedbacks rather than viewing individual components in isolation. Instead of asking how one factor affects another, systems thinking asks how multiple factors interact to influence the behavior of the entire system. Agriculture is an ideal example of a complex system. Food production depends on climate, soils, water resources, biodiversity, farmers, markets, infrastructure, technology, policies, and consumer behavior. Each of these components influences the others. A change in one part of the system can produce effects that ripple throughout the entire network. Consider climate change. Rising temperatures and changing rainfall patterns affect crop productivity. Changes in crop productivity influence food availability and food prices. Food prices affect household food security. Food insecurity can influence economic stability, public health, migration, and social well-being. What begins as a climatic change can therefore create consequences throughout society. The same interconnectedness applies to crop diversity. Crop diversity influences resilience. Resilience affects agricultural productivity. Productivity contributes to food security. Food security influences livelihoods and human well-being. At the same time, decisions made by farmers, governments, researchers, and consumers influence the level of diversity maintained within agricultural systems. In other words, these relationships are not linear. They form a network of interconnected feedback loops. The systems thinking framework presented in this module helps us visualize these relationships. At the foundation of the framework lies climate change and environmental variability. Rising temperatures, altered precipitation patterns, extreme weather events, and shifting ecological conditions create pressures on agricultural systems. These pressures influence crops, soils, water resources, pollinators, pests, diseases, and farming practices. Crop diversity and genetic diversity then act as sources of adaptive capacity. They provide the traits, characteristics, and biological options that help agricultural systems respond to environmental change. Through adaptation and resilience, these biological resources help stabilize agricultural production. Stable agricultural production contributes to food availability, food access, and nutritional security. Food security, in turn, supports economic development, social stability, public health, and human well-being. The framework also highlights the importance of feedback loops. For example, food insecurity may encourage unsustainable land use practices, which can contribute to environmental degradation and further reduce resilience. Conversely, investments in sustainable agriculture, conservation, and biodiversity can strengthen resilience and improve long-term food security. Systems thinking reminds us that actions often produce both direct and indirect consequences. A decision to conserve crop diversity does more than preserve seeds. It strengthens future breeding efforts, enhances adaptation options, supports resilience, contributes to food security, and ultimately benefits society. Similarly, the loss of diversity can create cascading effects. Reduced genetic resources may limit future adaptation, increase vulnerability to environmental stress, reduce resilience, and weaken food security over time. And another important insight from systems thinking is that no single solution can solve complex problems. Climate change cannot be addressed solely through improved crop varieties. Food security cannot be achieved solely through increased production. Resilience cannot be built through technology alone. Instead, solutions must operate across multiple levels simultaneously. Improved genetics, diversified farming systems, healthy soils, water management, conservation programs, supportive policies, scientific research, farmer knowledge, and sustainable markets all contribute to the resilience of the larger system. This perspective helps explain why crop diversity is so important. Crop diversity is not simply an agricultural issue. It is also a biodiversity issue, a climate adaptation issue, a food security issue, an economic issue, and ultimately a human well-being issue. Each of these dimensions is connected. The systems thinking framework encourages us to move beyond narrow perspectives and recognize these connections. It helps us understand that resilient food systems emerge not from isolated interventions, but from strengthening the relationships that support adaptation and sustainability. Perhaps the most important lesson of systems thinking is that resilience is an emergent property. It arises from diversity, connectivity, adaptability, and healthy interactions among system components. When these relationships are strong, systems are better able to absorb shocks and continue functioning despite change. As climate change accelerates and environmental uncertainty increases, systems thinking provides a valuable lens through which to understand both the challenges facing agriculture and the opportunities available for building resilience. The central message of this framework is simple but powerful. Climate change, biodiversity, crop diversity, agricultural resilience, food security, and human well-being are not separate issues. They are interconnected parts of the same system. And understanding those connections is essential for creating a sustainable and resilient future. We have now explored a wide range of concepts, from climate change and food security to crop diversity, genetic resources, resilience, adaptation, and systems thinking. Before moving forward, it is worth pausing to reflect on a broader question. Imagine that you are responsible for planning the future of a country's food system. You have been asked to develop a long-term strategy to ensure food security over the next 50 years. Climate change is expected to continue. Temperatures will likely rise. Rainfall patterns may shift. Extreme weather events may become more frequent. New pests and diseases may emerge. At the same time, the population will continue to grow, increasing demand for food. Given these uncertainties, where would you place your priorities? Would you focus primarily on increasing production? Would you invest heavily in technology and infrastructure? Would you prioritize irrigation, crop breeding, and agricultural research? Would you strengthen food distribution systems and market access? Or would you place greater emphasis on conserving biodiversity and crop diversity to ensure that future generations retain the ability to adapt? The reality, of course, is that there is no single correct answer. Each of these strategies contributes to resilience in different ways. However, systems thinking encourages us to recognize that long-term food security depends not only on what we produce today, but also on the options we preserve for tomorrow. This raises another important question. How much value should society place on resources that may not be immediately needed, but could become critically important in the future? A traditional crop variety growing in a remote farming community may appear to have limited economic value today. Yet that same variety may contain genes for drought tolerance, heat resistance, disease resistance, or flood tolerance that become essential under future climatic conditions. If that diversity disappears, the opportunity disappears with it. As you reflect on this question, consider the difference between efficiency and resilience. Highly efficient systems often focus on optimizing performance under current conditions. Resilient systems focus on maintaining the ability to function under changing conditions. Neither objective is unimportant. The challenge is finding an appropriate balance between them. Climate change makes this balance increasingly significant. The future will almost certainly contain surprises. Some challenges can be anticipated, others cannot. The less certain the future becomes, the more valuable flexibility, diversity, and adaptive capacity become. And this is one of the central themes running throughout the module. Diversity is not simply about preserving the past, it is about preserving possibilities for the future. The seeds conserved in gene banks, the land races maintained by farming communities, the crop wild relatives growing in natural ecosystems, and the diverse varieties cultivated around the world collectively represent a reservoir of options that future generations may depend upon. As you think about the future of agriculture, ask yourself, if climate change continues to increase uncertainty, what role should crop diversity play in building resilient food systems? And how can societies ensure that the genetic resources needed for future adaptation are not lost before they are needed? These questions lead directly into the next section of the module, where we will examine the global efforts being undertaken to conserve crop diversity and protect the genetic resources that support agricultural resilience. The future of food security may depend not only on what we grow today, but also on what we choose to conserve for tomorrow.